Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. This is section 2 from the very beginning of the work. It is entitled Elements, and it begins with paragraph 119. In order to give form to the materials hereinbefore set in order in the chronological table, we now propose the following axioms, both philosophical and philological, including a few reasonable and proper postulates and some clarified definitions. And just as the blood does in animate bodies, so will these elements course through our science and animate it in all its reasonings about the common nature of nations. 1. Paragraph 120 and 121. Because of the indefinite nature of the human mind, wherever it is lost in ignorance, man makes himself the measure of all things. This axiom explains the two common human traits. On the one hand, that rumor grows in its course, fama crescit eundo, and on the other, that rumor is deflated by the presence of the thing itself, minuit praesentia famam. In the long course that rumor has run from the beginning of the world, it has been the perennial source of all the exaggerated opinions which have hitherto been held concerning remote antiquities unknown to us, by virtue of that property of the human mind noted by Tacitus in his Life of Agricola, where he says that everything unknown is taken for something great. Omne ignotum pro magnifico est. 2. Paragraph 122. It is another property of the human mind that whenever men can form no idea of distant and unknown things, they judge them by what is familiar and at hand. 123. This axiom points to the inexhaustible source of all the errors about the beginnings of humanity that have been adopted by entire nations and by all the scholars. For when the former began to take notice of them, and the latter to investigate them, it was on the basis of their own enlightened, cultivated, and magnificent times that they judged the origins of humanity, which must nevertheless by the nature of things have been small, crude, and quite obscure. 124. Under this head are to be recalled two types of conceit we have mentioned above, one of the nations, and the other of the scholars. 3. 125. As for the conceit of the nations, we have heard that golden saying of Diodorus Siculus, every nation, according to him, whether Greek or barbarian, has had the same conceit that it before all other nations invented the comforts of human life, and that its remembered history goes back to the very beginning of the world. 126. This axiom disposes at once of the proud claims of the Chaldeans, Scythians, Egyptians, Chinese, to have been the first founders of the humanity of the ancient world. But Flavius Josephus the Jew purges his nation of this vain boast by that magnanimous confession that we have heard above, namely that the Hebrew had lived cut off from all the Gentiles. And sacred history assures us that the world is almost young in contrast to the antiquity with which it was credited by the Chaldeans, Scythians, Egyptians, and in our own day by the Chinese. This is a great proof of the truth of sacred history. 4. Paragraphs 127 and 128. To this conceit of the nations there may be added that of the scholars, who will have it that whatever they know is as old as the world. This axiom disposes of all the opinions of the scholars concerning the matchless wisdom of the ancients. It convicts of fraud the oracles of Zoroaster the Chaldean, of Anacharsis the Scythian, which have not come down to us, the Poimander of Hermes Trismegistus, the Orphics, or verses of Orpheus, and the golden verses of Pythagoras, as all the more discerning critics agree. It further condemns as impertinent all the mystic meanings with which the Egyptian hieroglyphs are endowed by the scholars, and the philosophical allegories which they have read into the Greek fables. 5. paragraphs 129 and 130. To be useful to the human race, philosophy must raise and direct weak and fallen man, not to rend his nature or abandon him in his corruption. This axiom dismisses from the school of our science the Stoics, who seek to mortify the senses, and the Epicureans, who make them the criterion. For both deny providence, the former chaining themselves to fate, the latter abandoning themselves to chance. The latter, moreover, affirm that the human soul dies with the body. Both should be called monastic or solitary philosophers. On the other hand, this axiom admits to our school the political philosophers, and first of all the Platonists, who agree with all the lawgivers on these three main points: that there is divine providence, that human passions should be moderated and made into human virtues, and that the human soul is immortal. Thus, from this axiom are derived the three principles of this science. 6. 131. Philosophy considers man as he should be, and so can be of service to but very few who wish to live in the Republic of Plato, not to fall back into the dregs of Romulus. 7. 132. Legislation considers man as he is in order to turn him to good uses in human society. Out of ferocity, avarice, and ambition, the three vices which run throughout the human race, it creates the military, merchant, and governing classes, and thus the strength, riches, and wisdom of commonwealths. Out of these three great vices, which could certainly destroy all mankind on the face of the earth, it makes civil happiness. 133. This axiom proves that there is divine providence, and further that it is a divine legislative mind. For out of the passions of men, each bent on his private advantage, for the sake of which they would live like wild beasts in the wilderness, it is made the civil orders by which they may live in human society. 8. 134. Things do not settle or endure out of their natural order. 135. In view of the fact that the human race, as far back as memory of the world goes, has lived and still lives comfortably in society, this axiom alone decides the great dispute still waged by the best philosophers and moral theologians against Carneades the skeptic and Epicurus, a dispute to which not even Grotius could put an end, namely, whether law exists by nature, or whether man is naturally sociable, which comes to the same thing. 136. This same axiom, together with the seventh and its corollary, proves that man has free choice, however weak, to make virtues of his passions, but that he is aided by God, naturally by divine providence, and supernaturally by divine grace. 9. 137. Men who do not know the truth of things try to reach certainty about them, so that if they cannot satisfy their intellects by science, their wills at least may rest on conscience. 10. 138. Philosophy contemplates reason, whence comes knowledge of the true. Philology observes the authority of human choice, whence comes consciousness of the certain. 139. This axiom, by its second part, defines as philologians all the grammarians, historians, critics who have occupied themselves with the study of languages and deeds of peoples, both their domestic affairs, such as customs and laws, and their external affairs, such as wars, peace, alliances, travels, and commerce. 134. This same axiom shows how the philosophers failed by half in not giving certainty to their reasonings by appeal to the authority of the philologians, and likewise how the latter failed by half in not taking care to give their authority the sanction of truth by appeal to the reasoning of the philosophers. If they had both done this, they would have been more useful to their commonwealths, and they would have anticipated us in conceiving this science. 11. 141. Human choice, by its nature most uncertain, is made certain and determined by the common sense of men with respect to human needs or utilities, which are the two origins of the natural law of nations. 12. 142. Common sense is judgment without reflection, shared by an entire class, an entire people, an entire nation, or the whole human race. 143. This axiom, with the following definition, will provide a new art of criticism concerning the founders of nations, who must have preceded by more than 1,000 years the writers with whom criticism has so far been occupied. 13. 144. Uniform ideas originating among entire peoples, unknown to each other, must have a common ground of truth. 145. This axiom is a great principle which establishes the common sense of the human race as the criterion taught to the nations by divine providence to define what is certain in the natural law of nations. And the nations reach this certainty by recognizing the underlying agreements which, despite variations of detail, obtain among them all in the respect of this law. Thence issues the mental dictionary for assigning origins to all the divers articulated languages. By means of this dictionary is conceived the ideal eternal history, which determines the histories in time of all the nations. The axioms proper to this dictionary and to this history will shortly be proposed. 146. This same axiom does away with all the ideas hitherto held concerning the natural law of nations, which has been thought to have originated in one nation, and been passed on to others. This error was encouraged by the bad example of the Egyptians and Greeks, in vainly boasting that they had spread civilization throughout the world. It was this error that gave rise to the fiction that the law of the 12 tables came to Rome from Greece. If that had been the case, it would have been a civil law communicated to other peoples by human provision, and not a law which divine providence ordained naturally in all nations, along with the human customs themselves. Indeed, it will be one of our constant labors throughout this book to demonstrate that the natural law of nations originated separately among the various peoples, each in ignorance of the others, and that subsequently, as a result of wars, embassies, alliances, and commerce, it came to be recognized as common to the entire human race. 14. 147. The nature of things is nothing but their coming into being, at certain times and in certain fashions. Whenever the time and fashion is thus and so, such and not and otherwise are things that come into being. 15. 148. The inseparable properties of things must be due to the mode or fashion in which they are born. By these properties we may therefore tell that the nature or birth, natura or nascimento, was thus and not otherwise. 16. 149. Vulgar traditions must have had public grounds of truth, by virtue of which they came into being and were preserved by entire peoples over long periods of time. 150. It will be another great labor of this science to recover these grounds of truth, which in the passage of years and the changes in languages and customs has come down to us enveloped in falsehood. 17. 151. The vulgar tongues should be the most weighty witnesses concerning those ancient customs of the peoples that were observed at the time when the languages were being formed. 18. 152. A language of an ancient nation, which has maintained itself as the dominant tongue throughout its development, should be a great witness to the customs of the early days of the world. 153. This axiom assures us that the weightiest philological proofs of the natural law of nations, in the understanding of which the Romans were unquestionably preeminent, can be drawn from Latin speech. For the same reason, scholars of the Germanic language can do the like, since it retains this same property possessed by the ancient Roman language. 19. 154. If the laws of the 12 tables were customs of the peoples of Latium, originating in the age of Saturn, remaining unwritten elsewhere in Latium, but set down by the Romans in bronze and guarded by the religious care by Roman jurisprudence, then this law is a great witness of the ancient natural law of the nations of Latium. 152. That this was true, in fact, we showed many years ago in our Principles of Universal Law, and the present work will throw further light upon it. 20. 156. If the poems of Homer are civil histories of ancient Greek customs, they will be two great treasure houses of the natural law of the nations of Greece. 157. For the present, this axiom is merely assumed. Later, its truth will be demonstrated. 21. 158. The Greek philosophers hastened the natural course which their nation was to undergo, for when they appeared, the Greeks were still in a crude state of barbarism, from which they advanced immediately to one of the highest refinement, while at the same time preserving intact their fables both of gods and of heroes. The Romans, on the other hand, proceeding at an even pace in the development of their customs, quite lost sight of the history of their gods, whence the Age of the Gods, as the Egyptians named it, is called by Varro the obscure period of the Romans, but preserved in vulgar speech their heroic history, which extends from the time of Romulus to the Publilian and Petalian laws, and which will be found to be a continuous historic mythology of the Greek age of the heroes. 159. That this is the nature of human civil affairs is confirmed by the example of the French nation, for in the midst of the barbarism of the 12th century there was opened the famous Parisian school, where Peter Lombard, the celebrated master of the sentences, began to lecture on the subtlest scholastic theology. And like a Homeric poem, there still lived on the history of the Bishop of Turpin of Paris, full of those fables of the heroes of France called paladins, which were later to fill so many romances and poems. And because of this premature passage from barbarism to the subtlest sciences, French remained a language of the greatest refinement. So much so indeed that all the living languages, it seems most to have restored to our times the Atticism of the Greeks, and it is the best of all languages for scientific reasoning, as the Greek was. Yet French preserves, as Greek did, many diphthongs, which are natural to a barbarous tongue, still stiff and inept at combining consonants with vowels. In confirmation of what we have said of both these languages, we may here add an observation in regard to young people at an age when memory is tenacious, imagination vivid, and wit nimble. At this age, they may profitably occupy themselves with languages and plain geometry, without thereby subduing that acerbity of minds still bound to the body, which may be called the barbarism of the intellect. But if they pass on while yet in this immature stage to the highly subtle studies of metaphysical criticism or algebra, they become overfine for life in their way of thinking and are rendered incapable of any great work. 160. But as we further meditated this work, we came upon another cause for the effect in question, and this cause is perhaps more apposite. Romulus founded Rome in the midst of the other more ancient cities of Latium, and founded it by opening there the asylum which Livy defines generally as an old council of founders of cities, vetus urbis condentium concilium. For since violence still reigned, he naturally established the city of Rome on the same basis on which the oldest cities of the world had been founded. And so it came about, since Roman customs were developing from such beginnings at a time when the vulgar tongues of Latium were already well advanced, that Roman civil affairs, the like of which the Greeks had set forth in heroic speech, were set forth by the Romans in vulgar speech. Thus ancient Roman history will be found to be a continuous mythology of the heroic history of the Greeks, and this must be the reason why the Romans were the heroes of the world. For Rome subdued the other cities of Latium, then Italy, and finally the whole world, because heroism was still young among the Romans, whereas among the other peoples of Latium, from whose conquest all the greatness of Rome sprang, it must already have begun to decay. 22. 161. There must in the nature of human things be a mental language common to all nations, which uniformly grasps the substance of things feasible in human social life, and expresses it with as many diverse modifications as these same things may have diverse aspects. A proof of this is afforded by proverbs or maxims of vulgar wisdom, in which substantially the same meanings find as many diverse expressions as there are nations ancient and modern. 162. This common mental language is proper to our science, by whose light linguistic scholars will be enabled to construct a mental vocabulary common to all the various articulate languages, living and dead. We gave a particular example of this in the first edition of the New Science. There we proved that the names of the first family fathers, in a great number of living and dead languages, were given them because of the various properties which they had in the state of the families and of the first commonwealths, at the time when the nations were forming their languages. As far as our small erudition will permit, we shall make use of this vocabulary in all the matters we discuss. 163. Of all the aforesaid propositions, the first, second, third, and fourth give us the basis for refuting all opinions hitherto held about the beginnings of humanity. The refutations turn on the improbabilities, absurdities, and contradictions and impossibilities of these opinions. The subsequent propositions from the 5th to the 15th, which give us the basis of truth, will serve for considering this world of nations in its eternal idea, by that property of every science noted by Aristotle, that science has to do with what is universal and eternal. The last propositions from the 15th to the 22nd will give us the basis of certitude. By their use we shall be able to see in fact this world of nations, which we have studied in idea, following the method of philosophizing made most certain by Francis Bacon, Lord of Verulam, but carrying it over from the things of nature, on which he composed his book Cogitata et Visa, to the civil affairs of mankind. 164. The propositions set forth above are general and are the basis of our science throughout. Those which follow are particular and provide more specific bases for the various matters it treats of. 23. 165. Sacred history is more ancient than all the most ancient profane histories that have come down to us, for it narrates in great detail, and over a period of more than 800 years, the state of nature under the patriarchs. That is, the state of the families out of which, by general agreement of political theorists, the people and cities later arose. Of this family state, profane history has told us nothing or little, and that little quite confused. 166. This axiom proves the truth of sacred history, as against the national conceit pointed out to us by Diodorus Siculus, for the Hebrews have preserved their memories in full detail from the beginning of the world. 24. 167. The Hebrew religion was founded by the true God on the prohibition of the divination on which all the Gentile nations arose. 168. This axiom is one of the principal reasons for the division of the entire world of the ancient nations into Hebrews and Gentiles. 25. 169. That the flood was worldwide is proved not indeed by the philological evidence of Martin Schuck, for it is far too slight, nor by the astrological evidence of Cardinal Pier di Eli, followed by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. For this latter evidence is too uncertain, indeed quite false, relying as it does on the Alphonsine tables, which were refuted by the Jews and are now refuted by the Christians, who, having rejected the calculations of Eusebius and Bede, now follow these of Philo the Jew. But our demonstration will be drawn from physical histories discerned in the fables, as will be seen from the following axioms. 26. 170. The giants were by nature of enormous build, like those monstrous and fierce creatures which travelers claim to have seen at the foot of America, in the country of the so-called Patagons. And putting aside the vain, abortive, and false reasons adduced to these creatures by the philosophers, as collected and followed by Chassignon in his De Gigantibus, we shall adduce the causes, partly physical and partly moral, observed by Julius Caesar and Cornelius Tacitus, in speaking of the gigantic stature of the ancient Germans. In our view, these causes are to be traced to the savage education of their children. 27. 171. Greek history, from which we get all we know about the history of all the ancient Gentile nations, except the Roman, starts with the flood and the giants. 172. These two axioms make it evident that the entire original human race was divided into two species, the one of giants, the other of men of normal stature, the former Gentiles, the latter Hebrews. Also, that this difference can only have come about as the result of the savage education of the former and the human education of the latter. Hence, that the Hebrews had a different origin from that of the Gentiles. 28. 173. Two great remnants of Egyptian antiquity have come down to us, as we have noted above, in paragraph 53. One of them is the fact that the Egyptians reduced all preceding world time to three ages, namely the age of the gods, the age of the heroes, and the age of men. The other is that during those 3 ages, 3 languages had been spoken, corresponding in order to the 3 aforesaid ages, namely the hieroglyphic or sacred language, the symbolic or figurative, which is the heroic language, and the epistolary or vulgar language of men employing conventional signs for communicating the common needs of their life. 29. 174. Homer, in 5 passages from his 2 poems to be cited later, mentions a language more ancient than his own, which was certainly a heroic language, and calls it the language of the gods. 30. 175. Varro had the diligence to assemble 30,000 names of gods, for the Greeks counted that many. These were related to as many needs of physical, moral, economic, or civil life of the earliest times. 176. These 3 axioms establish the fact that the world of peoples began everywhere with religion. This will be the first of the 3 principles of this science. 31. 177. Wherever a people has grown savage in arms, so that the human laws have no longer any place among it, the only powerful means of reducing it is religion. 178. This axiom establishes the fact that divine providence initiated the process by which the fierce and violent were brought from their outlaw state to humanity and entered upon national life. It did so by awakening in them a confused idea of divinity, which they in their ignorance attributed to that which it did not belong. Thus, through the terror of this imagined divinity, they began to put themselves in some order. 179. Such an initiating principle of things Thomas Hobbes failed to see among his fierce and violent men, because he went afield in search of principles, and fell into error with the chance of his Epicurus. He thought to enrich Greek philosophy by adding a great part which it certainly had lacked, as George Pasch observes in his On the Learned Discoveries of this Age, the whole study of man and the whole society of the human race. But the result was as unhappy as the effort was noble. Nor would Hobbes have conceived this project if the Christian religion had not given him the inspiration for it. For it demands of all mankind not merely justice, but charity. From this point begins the refutation of the false dictum of Polybius, that if the world had philosophers, there would be no need of religions. For if there were in the world no commonwealths, which cannot arise without religions, it would have no philosophers. 32. 180. When men are ignorant of the natural causes producing things, and cannot even explain them by analogy with similar things, they attribute their own nature to them. The vulgar, for example, says the magnet loves the iron. 181. This axiom is embraced by the first, namely that the human mind, because of its indefinite nature, wherever it is lost in ignorance, makes itself the rule of the universe in respect of everything it does not know. 33. 182. The physics of the ignorant is a vulgar metaphysics by which they refer the causes of the things they do not know to the will of God, without considering the means by which the divine will operates. 34. 183. That is a true property of the human mind which Tacitus points out, where he says, "Minds once cowed are prone to superstition. Once men are seized by a frightful superstition, they refer to it all they imagine, see, or even do." 35. 184. Wonder is the daughter of ignorance, and the greater the object of wonder, the more the wonder grows. 36. 185. Imagination is more robust in proportion as reasoning power is weak. 37. 186. The most sublime labor of poetry is to give sense and passion to insensate things, and it is characteristic of children to take inanimate things in their hands and talk to them and play as if they were living persons. 187. This philologico-philosophical axiom proves to us that in the world's childhood men were by nature sublime poets. 38. 188. That is a golden passage in Lactantius Firmianus, where he considers the origins of idolatry, saying, "Rude men at first called them, i.e. the king and his family, gods, either for their wonderful excellence, wonderful it seemed to men still rude and simple, or, as commonly happens, in admiration of present power, or on account of the benefits by which they had been conducted to civilization." 39. 189. Curiosity, that inborn property of man, daughter of ignorance and mother of knowledge, when wonder wakens our minds, has the habit, wherever it sees some extraordinary phenomenon of nature, a comet for example, a sundog, or a midday star, of asking straightway what it means. 40. 190. Witches who are full of frightful superstitions are exceedingly savage and cruel. Indeed, if it is necessary for the solemnizing of their witchcraft, they do not shrink from killing and dismembering tender, innocent children. 191. All these propositions, from the 28th to the 38th, reveal to us the beginnings of divine poetry, or poetic theology. From the 31st on, they give us the beginnings of idolatry. From the 39th, the beginnings of divination. And the 40th finally gives us the beginnings of sacrifice in connection with bloodthirsty religions. These sacrifices began among the first crude savage men with votive offerings and human victims. The latter, as we learn from Plautus, were by the Latins vulgarly called Saturn's victims. They were the sacrifices to Moloch among the Phoenicians, who passed through the fire the children consecrated to that false divinity. Some of these consecrations were preserved in the law of the 12 tables. These things give the right sense to that saying, "Fear first created gods in the world." False religions were born not of imposture, but of credulity. Likewise, the unhappy vow and sacrifice that Agamemnon made of his pious daughter Iphigenia, at which Lucretius impiously exclaims, "So great were the evils religion could prompt," derived from the counsel of divine providence. For all this was necessary to tame the sons of the Cyclopes, and reduce them to the humanity, and Aristides, a Socrates, a Laelius, and Scipio Africanus. 41. 192. We postulate, and the postulate is reasonable, that for several hundred years the earth, soaked by the water of the universal flood, sent forth no dry exhalations, or matter capable of igniting in the air to produce lightning. 42. Paragraphs 193 through 195. Jove hurls his bolts and fells the giants, and every Gentile nation had its Jove. This axiom contains the physical history that the fables have preserved for us, that the universal deluge covered the whole earth. This same axiom, with its preceding postulate, should make it clear to us that for a long period of time the impious races of the three children of Noah had wandered in a wild state, and in their feral wandering had become scattered and dispersed through the great forest of the earth, and that with their wild education giants had sprung up and existed among them at the time when the heavens thundered for the first time after the flood. 43. 196 through 198. Every Gentile nation had its Hercules, who was the son of Jove, and Varro, the most learned of antiquarians, numbered as many as 40 of them. This axiom marks the beginning of heroism among the first peoples, which was born of the false opinion that the heroes were of divine origin. This same axiom, and the preceding one, giving us so many Joves, and then so many Herculeses among the Gentile nations, together show us that these nations could not have been founded without religion, and could not grow without courage. Moreover, since in their beginnings these nations were forest-bred, and shut off from any knowledge of each other, and since by Axiom 13, uniform ideas, born among peoples unknown to each other, must have a common ground of truth, these axioms give us a great principle as well, that the first fables must have contained civil truths, and must therefore have been the histories of the first peoples. 44. 199. The first sages of the Greek world were the theological poets, who certainly flourished before the heroic poets, just as Jove was the father of Hercules. 200. This and the two preceding axioms establish the fact that all the Gentile nations, inasmuch as they all had their Joves and Herculeses, were poetic in their beginnings, and that divine poetry was born first among them, and later heroic poetry. 45. 201. Men are naturally impelled to preserve the memories of the laws and orders that bind them in their societies. 46. 202. All barbarian histories have fabulous beginnings. 203. All these axioms, from the 42nd on, gives us the beginning of our historical mythology. 47. 204. The human mind is naturally impelled to take delight in uniformity. 205. This axiom, as applied to the fables, is confirmed by the habit the vulgar have when making up fables of men famous for this or that, and these or those circumstances of making the fable fit the character and occasion. These fables are ideal truths, conforming to the merits of those of whom the vulgar tell them, and such falseness, in fact, as they now and then contain, consists simply in failure to give their subjects their due. So that, if we consider the matter well, poetic truth is metaphysical truth, and physical truth which is not in conformity with it should be considered false. Thence springs this important consideration in poetic theory. The true war chief, for example, is the Godfrey that Tasso imagines, and all the chiefs who do not conform throughout to Godfrey are not true chiefs of war. 48. 206. The nature of children is such that by the ideas and names associated with the first men, women, and things they have known, they afterwards apprehend and name all the men, women, and things which have any resemblance or relation to the first. 49. 207. A truly golden passage is that above cited by Iamblichus on the mysteries of the Egyptians, to the effect that the Egyptians attributed to Hermes Trismegistus all discoveries useful or necessary to human life. 208. This statement, supported by the preceding axiom, will turn back to this divine philosopher all the senses of sublime natural theology that he himself attributed to the mysteries of the Egyptians. 209. These three axioms give us the origin of the poetic characters that constitute the essence of the fables. The first of the three shows the natural inclination of the vulgar to invent them, and to invent them appropriately. The second shows that the first men, the children as it were of the human race, not being able to form intelligible class concepts of things, had a natural need to create poetic characters, that is, imaginative class concepts or universals, by reducing to them as to certain models or ideal portraits all the particular species which resembled them. Because of the resemblance, the ancient fables could not but be created appropriately. Just so the Egyptians reduced to the genus civil sage all their inventions useful or necessary to the human race which are particular effects of civil wisdom, and because they could not abstract the intelligible genus civil sage, much less the form of the civil wisdom in which these Egyptians were sages, they imagined it forth as Hermes Trismegistus. So far were the Egyptians, at the time when they were enriching the world with discoveries useful or necessary to the human race, from being philosophers and understanding universals or intelligible class concepts. 210. This last axiom, following on those preceding, is the principle of the true poetic allegories which gave fables univocal rather than analogous meanings for various particulars comprised under their poetic genre. They were therefore called diversoliquia, that is, expressions comprising in one general concept various species of men, deeds, or things. 50. 211. In children, memory is most vigorous, and imagination is therefore excessively vivid, for imagination is nothing but extended or compounded memory. 212. This axiom is the explanation of the vividness of the poetic images the world had to form in its first childhood. This is the end of subsections 1 through 50 of Elements, from section 2 of The New Science by Giambattista Vico. In the next video, we will complete section 2. Thank you for listening.